She raised her paddle, and the room laughed. Not politely, not kindly. They laughed like it was a joke, like the idea of someone like her bidding at an elite auction was a comedy sketch they were all in on. But within the next 10 minutes, their smiles would disappear one by one, as her husband walked in and placed a bid no one in the room could match. The auction hall was a glittering shrine to wealth and status. Crystal chandeliers sparkled from the high ceilings, soft jazz floated through the air, and everything smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood. Velvet ropes divided the elite from the observers, and champagne was served only to those seated in the front rows. Elena stood quietly near the back, holding a small numbered paddle and wearing a dress that was elegant but not loud. Cream-colored, ankle-length, no designer label, just tastefully simple. Her hair was tied in a low bun, her makeup soft, her heels flat and silent. She did not belong, at least not to them. She had arrived alone, she had smiled politely, and that was enough for the judgment to begin. The woman beside the check-in table looked her up and down, eyes pausing on her modest handbag and plain wristwatch. "Spectators sit toward the back," she said, without checking Elena's invitation. Elena only nodded, unwilling to create a scene. She knew this kind of place well, the kind that saw a quiet woman as invisible. As she walked past rows of suited collectors and glittering socialites, whispers followed. Someone muttered, "She must be lost." Another, half-laughing, said, "Maybe she is just here for the free wine." Elena heard it all but kept walking, her gaze fixed on the small stage and the painting displayed behind the auctioneer's podium. It was Lot 43, the final work of Marcus Vail, a piece her husband had once described as the only painting that ever made him stop breathing. It had been privately owned for years. Now it was up for sale, and she was here for it, not to impress the crowd, not to show off wealth, but because she knew what it meant. Her husband could not be there, so she came instead, quietly, without an entourage or a spotlight. And now she stood beneath the crystal light, alone in a room of noise and pride, waiting for the moment that painting was called. And it was coming. As the auctioneer raised his gavel and announced the arrival of Lot 43, the room shifted. The quiet hum of conversation faded into an expectant hush. All eyes turned toward the stage as the veil was drawn back, revealing a large, hauntingly beautiful painting. A seascape, wild and stormy, with a single beam of sunlight cutting through thick clouds. It was the final work of Marcus Vail, raw, emotional, and utterly irreplaceable. People leaned forward, paddles were gripped tightly. The auctioneer, a tall man with a practiced smile and an even more practiced voice, began with confidence. "We will start the bidding at $1 million. A paddle shot up immediately from the front row. Then another, then another. The numbers climbed quickly. 1.2, 1.4, 1.6. Elena remained silent. Her fingers clutched her paddle gently. Her heart beat steadily. She watched the crowd more than the painting, the way their faces twisted in competition, the way one woman nudged her partner, pointing at Elena with a smirk when she finally raised her paddle at 2 million. A ripple of laughter followed. The auctioneer even paused, eyes flicking to the back of the room. 2 million, he repeated. Then, after a moment, added lightly, from the back row. Elena said nothing. She did not need to explain herself. Whispers began again. She cannot be serious. She probably thought she was bidding for a print. She will be escorted out when she cannot pay. The woman in the red dress 2 rows ahead turned around, her diamonds catching the light. She gave Elena a pitying smile. "Sweetheart, this is not a charity raffle." Elena blinked, once, and looked away. The auctioneer cleared his throat and resumed. "We have 2.2 million. Do I hear 2.4? The bids continued, the air growing tighter with each number called. Elena did not raise her paddle again, not yet, but the murmurs grew louder behind her, questioning, mocking, dismissing. One man loudly joked, "Maybe she thinks her husband will come flying in to save the day." Elena exhaled, slow and calm, and looked toward the large glass doors at the back of the hall, because in just a few moments he would. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the room, still upbeat, but now tinged with disbelief as the numbers climbed higher. "We are now at 3.6 million. Do I hear 3.8? Gasps followed. The tension in the room was thick, like the air before a summer storm. Faces flushed with competition. Eyes darted around, searching for signs of retreat from the other bidders. But underneath the tension, the undertone remained. Not everyone was welcome here. Not really. Especially not a quiet woman in a simple black dress, sitting alone in the back. Elena had become the target of the room's attention, not because of her bid, but because she was out of place, or so they believed. Her outfit, while elegant, lacked brand logos or the unmistakable sheen of new wealth. Her jewelry was minimal, her posture composed, but not commanding. In a room filled with showmanship and posturing, she was simply calm. And for some, that alone was enough reason to doubt her. The woman in red turned to her friends and whispered just loudly enough for Elena to hear. This is what happens when security is too polite. Anyone with a borrowed dress can walk in. Elena looked at the painting again, allowing their words to wash past her. She had learned long ago that silence often rattled. Then, just as the next bid came in at 4.2, the glass doors at the back of the hall opened. The light from the foyer poured in first, and then he stepped inside. Elena's husband, Gabriel Rios. The energy shifted in an instant. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned so fast that a few guests nearly dropped their wine glasses. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, Gabriel walked forward with the kind of confidence that never had to be loud to be noticed. The kind of confidence that came from owning not just wealth, but legacy. Whispers exploded. That is Gabriel Rios, the venture capitalist. No, the art philanthropist. He owns galleries in New York and Paris. I thought he was in Tokyo this week. Elena remained seated, her gaze softening as her husband reached her row. He said nothing at first, simply nodding at her gently before turning to face the stage. 5 million, Gabriel said, voice low but crystal clear. Silence. The auctioneer blinked. 5 million, from Mr. Gabriel Rios. There were no more bids. Elena leaned back in her chair. The same people who had laughed at her minutes ago now sat frozen, stunned into awkward quiet. The woman in red lowered her gaze, suddenly interested in her program booklet. And Elena? She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply folded her hands in her lap, calm as ever. Because for her, this moment was not about revenge. It was about reminding them all that power often arrives quietly and never needs to explain itself. The final slam of the gavel echoed through the room like a firework that no one had expected. Sold, the auctioneer announced, for $5 million to Mr. Gabriel Rios. What followed was not applause. It was silence. A thick, sticky quiet settled over the elite crowd. They were no longer sipping champagne or laughing in tight little groups. Instead, they stared, not just at Gabriel, but at Elena. The same woman they had mocked minutes earlier was now the center of a room that suddenly remembered how to blink. Gabriel turned to Elena, offering his hand. She took it, rising gracefully from her chair, still not a single word from either of them. It was the quiet that unnerved the room more than anything else, the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made people rethink everything they had just assumed. The woman in red stood rigidly, clutching her empty wine glass. One of her friends leaned in with a whisper that was now shaky, uncertain. She is married to him? The Gabriel Rios? Elena and Gabriel began walking toward the front of the room. The crowd instinctively parted, like water making way for a ship. They passed art critics, gallery owners, CEOs, and socialites, all now reduced to observers. The hierarchy had flipped in less than 5 minutes, and no one knew how to recover from it. The painting Gabriel had just bought now stood as more than a piece of art. It was a symbol of taste, of authority, of a connection so deep that it did not need to be explained or advertised. It was not about money anymore. It was about respect. A reporter stepped forward, microphone raised slightly, her voice cautious. "Mr. Rios, may I ask what inspired your purchase tonight?" Gabriel glanced at Elena, then looked back at the reporter. "It reminded me of my wife," he said. "Beautiful, underestimated, and clearly the most valuable piece in the room." There was a faint rustle, like a collective intake of breath. Elena did not flinch. She had stood alone in a room that treated her like a shadow. Now, that same room could not stop looking at her. As they stepped up to finalize the purchase with the auction staff, the spotlight followed. Literally, one of the ceiling lights tilted, casting a gentle glow over her simple black dress, the same dress they had laughed at before. Now, it looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. And while the crowd tried to rearrange their expressions, Elena stayed exactly the same, composed, graceful, and unbothered, because the truth had never changed, only people's perception of it. Back in the quiet corridor outside the auction hall, Elena finally let herself breathe. The pressure in her chest, built up from hours of whispered insults and glances meant to cut, finally began to ease. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, a sound so subtle and steady, it almost masked the thrum of thoughts racing through her mind. Gabriel walked beside her, his presence calm and protective, but not overbearing. He did not say much, he never needed to. His support came in quiet gestures, a hand on her back, the slight pull of her arm to guide her gently away from the noise, the way he shielded her from the lingering stares of people still watching from the edges of the gallery. When they reached the private lounge, a quiet space reserved for high-profile guests, Gabriel finally turned to face her. "They treated you like you did not belong," he said, "like you were invisible." Elena nodded slowly, still holding in more than she cared to admit. "It has always been like that," she said, "ever since I stopped dressing the way they do. Ever since I chose to live simply." "You never needed their validation," Gabriel replied, "but now they will remember you, and not because of me, because of how you held your head high while they tried to break it down." Elena leaned against the edge of a velvet sofa, her reflection catching in the tall mirror across the room. For a moment, she barely recognized the woman staring back, not because of the dress or the jewelry, but because of the strength in her posture. The strength that had always been there, hidden beneath years of silence. Downstairs, whispers continued to stir. Social media posts were already going viral, short clips of Gabriel's bid, photos of Elena walking beside him, headlines speculating who she was. The same people who had mocked her were now resharing her image with captions like "Mystery Power Couple" and "The Woman Behind the $5 million painting." But Elena was not interested in going viral. She had not come for attention. She had not even come to prove a point. She had only come to enjoy the art. And yet she had ended up changing the atmosphere of an entire event, not through wealth or force, but through quiet resilience. Gabriel stepped closer, placing a hand gently over hers. "Would you like to leave?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I think I would like to go back in." His brow lifted slightly, surprised. "Are you sure?" Elena stood tall and smoothed out the creases in her dress. "Yes, I want them to see me again. Not as your wife, not as the woman they laughed at, but as myself." So they walked back together, side by side, as equals. This time, not a single person dared to speak when she entered, not because they were afraid, but because they were finally paying attention. As Elena and Gabriel re-entered the main hall, the atmosphere shifted like the hush before a grand symphony begins. The crowd that had once barely registered her presence now parted for her without a word. Conversations stilled, champagne flutes paused mid-air, faces that had been twisted in sneers just an hour ago were now carefully neutral or nervously polite. The spotlight that once ignored her was now unavoidable, but Elena did not shy away from it. She walked slowly past the painting Gabriel had purchased, now surrounded by a growing crowd, each person trying to understand what made it so valuable. None of them realized that the painting was not the true centerpiece of the night. It was Elena. A woman in designer silk, the same one who had scoffed at Elena's necklace, offered a timid nod as they passed. Another man, one of the ones who had laughed too loudly earlier, stepped aside and opened a path for her, his eyes downcast. It was not apology, not quite, but it was something. Elena paused beside a small sculpture tucked away near the back wall, a modest piece unnoticed by the socialites clamoring for headline-worthy buys. She looked at it with quiet admiration, not because it was expensive, but because it spoke to her. It reminded her of the early days, before any wealth, before the world cared who she was married to. "I love this one," she said softly, mostly to herself. "Then it is yours," Gabriel replied without hesitation. She turned to him with a smile. I do not need it to be mine. I just needed to see it. That is enough. He smiled back, not arguing. He understood. As the evening came to a close, the auctioneer took the mic to thank the guests for their attendance. But before he could move to final acknowledgments, he paused, looking at Gabriel and Elena seated quietly near the front row. There are moments, he said slowly, that remind us art is not just about prestige or price. Tonight we were reminded that grace, humility, and quiet strength are just as powerful as any bidding war. We are honored to have had Mr. and Mrs. King with us. Applause followed, not the polite kind, the real kind, the kind that swells from changed minds. Elena did not rise to acknowledge it. She did not need to. Her presence had already spoken. Later, as they stepped into the back of the waiting car, Gabriel looked at her with that same unwavering gaze. "You changed the room," he said. "No," Elena replied, leaning her head back against the seat with quiet satisfaction. "I reminded them how small the room really was." The city lights blurred against the window as they pulled away. Behind them, the guests remained. The gossip continued. The photos would circulate, but Elena had taken nothing with her, and somehow she had left with everything. And from that night on, when her name came up, it was no longer in mockery. It was in awe.